Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So, imagine waking up tomorrow morning and realizing that every single frustration in your life, every lingering grievance you hold, and like every ounce of baseline anxiety you carry was literally constructed by your own mind. That is a terrifying yet ultimately liberating premise we're tackling today.
Yeah, it really is a heavy premise. It fundamentally shifts the burden of reality, away from what happens to us and places it squarely on how we process what happens to us.
Right. And we're taking a deep dive into the first 4 chapters of the Dhammapada today, specifically the chapters titled The Twin Verses on Earnestness, Thought, and Flowers. Our mission here is to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and, the immediate life application from this text.
Exactly, because reading a revered ancient philosophy is one thing, but figuring out how it changes the way you handle a passive-aggressive email on a Tuesday morning is entirely another.
Oh, for sure. It's totally different.
To do that effectively, well, we need to understand the psychological landscape the author was addressing. The Dhammapada emerged from a philosophical tradition deeply concerned with universal human suffering. It isn't a text about abstract theology, right? It's a granular psychological manual for dealing with distraction, craving, and the quest for true liberation, which is often referred to as nirvana.
So not exactly light reading.
No, not at all. And the audience wasn't a group of people who had life figured out. They were individuals struggling with the exact same internal chaos, the same jealousy, and the same lack of focus that we deal with right now.
Yeah, I always say the human operating system hasn't had a major hardware update in like a few thousand years. Right. We are basically running the exact same faulty code.
We really are. And throughout this deep dive, you're going to hear about a few recurring archetypes that the text uses to describe this operating system. First, there's Mara. You can think of Mara as the tempter, but this isn't, a demon hiding in the bushes.
Right. It's more psychological than that.
Yeah, exactly. Mara represents the psychological gravity of distraction, destruction, ego, and the illusion of the material world. It's basically the force that pulls your attention away from clarity.
In today's world, Mara is the dopamine hit, right? Mara is the notification ping on your phone when you're trying to have a meaningful conversation with your spouse, or like that sudden, intense urge to buy a new car you don't need just to impress neighbors you don't even like.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The second archetype is Yama, the Lord of the Departed. Now, Yama represents the inescapable reality of mortality and death, but not necessarily something to fear.
More like a wake-up call.
Yes, an urgent focal point to keep you grounded in what actually matters. And finally, there is the bhikshu, the mendicant, or the seeker. This represents the person actively trying to wake up, the individual working relentlessly to live intentionally. So our goal today is to take these ancient frameworks, Mara, Yama, and the bhikshu, and apply them to your daily life.
Awesome. Let's start right at the beginning of the text because the author does not waste time warming up the audience. The very first line establishes what I kind of think of as the architecture of reality. Before we can talk about how to behave in society, we have to talk about the thoughts that literally build the world we experience.
The opening lines are incredibly stark. The text states, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts." It's a massive, uncompromising claim.
It really is.
Yeah, it completely obliterates the idea that we are passive victims of our circumstances.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to a modern ear, hearing all that we are is the result of what we have thought sounds dangerously close to the toxic positivity we see all over the internet.
Oh, absolutely.
You know the type. Like, just manifest good vibes, ignore the negative, and the universe will hand you $1 million. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I didn't think that bus into existence.
Yeah.
So we have to define what the text actually means here because it's not promoting magical thinking, is it?
Not at all. The distinction lies in the mechanism of cognitive architecture. The text isn't saying your thoughts magically alter physical reality or summon buses out of nowhere. It's saying your thoughts construct your subjective reality, which is, the only reality you actually experience.
Right, your perception of the world.
Exactly. If a person speaks or acts with an evil thought, the text says pain follows them, as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the carriage.
And we should probably define evil thought here, too. We aren't talking about cartoon villainy, right? We're talking about thoughts rooted in, ignorance, selfishness, or hatred.
Yes, precisely. An evil thought in this context is a thought that is out of alignment with reality. It's a thought driven by grasping or aversion. And the metaphor of the wheel following the ox is incredibly deliberate.
How so?
Well, think about the mechanics of an ox pulling a heavy cart. The cart is burdensome. It drags. It crushes the ground beneath it. If your foundational thoughts are built on resentment, every action you take is hitched to that resentment.
Wow, so you're just dragging it everywhere.
Exactly. The pain that follows you isn't a punishment handed down by some judgmental universe. It's just the mechanical, natural consequence of the cognitive engine you've built. The wheel has no choice but to follow the ox.
So, if our thoughts are the blueprint, most of us are building without a permit. I mean, we have absolutely zero quality control over what is happening in our heads. Let's modernize the ox and the cart for a second.
Sure, let's do it.
In today's world, that heavy dragging cart is the algorithmic social media feed. What you click on, what you hover over, what you choose to give your attention to, that is the ox. That is your thought. And the algorithm hitches a massive cart of reality to that ox.
That is a perfect modern translation.
Right, because if you spend your Tuesday morning clicking on outrage-inducing political videos, you are feeding the ox of grievance. For the next week, your feed, your suggested articles, and your notifications are going to serve you a crushing, heavy reality of anger, division, and anxiety.
And taking your algorithmic feed analogy a step further, the most dangerous part isn't just that the wheel follows the ox. It's that the sheer weight and momentum of the cart eventually starts pushing the ox.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the momentum takes over.
Exactly. When you are constantly fed a reality of division and anger, your subsequent thoughts become even more divided and angry. You become trapped in a self-reinforcing loop. This is why the text offers the alternative in the very next verse.
What's the alternative?
It says that if a person speaks or acts with a pure thought, happiness follows them, like a shadow that never leaves him.
A shadow doesn't crush the ground. A shadow is weightless.
And effortless, you know. You don't have to strain to drag your shadow behind you. When your thoughts are pure, meaning they are clear, objective, and free from the grasping of Mara, the resulting peace isn't something you have to force. It simply accompanies you naturally.
This mirrors modern cognitive behavioral therapy and neuroplasticity so perfectly. The idea that neurons that fire together wire together. If we practice pure thought, we literally rewire the physical structure of our brains to perceive happiness more easily. But accepting this demands 100% radical responsibility for our internal state.
It really does. And it is incredibly uncomfortable to admit that our recurring pain, our constant workplace conflicts, or our chronic dissatisfaction might actually be tied to the cart of our own cyclical negative thoughts.
Because we much prefer to blame the road or the weather or the other people on the path.
We do. It requires a brutal level of self-honesty to look at the ox we're feeding. The text is urging you, the listener, to examine the mechanism of your own suffering.
So the reflection here is immediate. What heavy, burdensome reality are you dragging through your days right now? And more importantly, what specific thought pattern is pulling it? Is it a pattern of scarcity? A pattern of constant comparison? You cannot change the cart until you tame the ox.
Exactly. And it's so much easier to just say, my boss is toxic and that's why my life is miserable, rather than saying, I have cultivated a mental habit of feeling victimized.
Yeah, and so every piece of feedback my boss gives me feels like an assault, which provides a perfect, albeit uncomfortable, bridge into the next major concept in Chapter 1. Because if our thoughts build our reality, what happens when those thoughts are entirely consumed by how other people have wronged us?
Well, we move from the internal architecture of the mind directly into the realm of external conflict. The text goes hard after the poison of grievance. It specifically calls out the narrative of grievance with this recurring cyclical quote. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me.
He abused me, he defeated me, he robbed me. I mean, that is literally the anthem of the modern internet. We have built entire subcultures around collecting, refining, and trading grievances.
We really have. We treat grievances as if they are valuable currency.
Yeah, we wear them like badges of honor, trying to prove who has been defeated or robbed the most.
But the text maps out the psychological loop this creates. Verse 3 states plainly that in those who harbor such thoughts, hatred will never cease. Verse 4 provides the antidote. In those who do not harbor such thoughts, hatred will cease.
It's just so binary.
It is. Replaying the tape of your own victimization basically guarantees that the hatred stays alive in your nervous system.
So it's essentially emotional self-harm.
It is. And the ancient rule provided here is found in verse 5, which is one of the most famous lines in the entire text. It says, "For hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an old rule.
You see this concept echoed across almost every major wisdom tradition in human history. You cannot extinguish a fire by throwing more combustible material onto it.
Right. You just make the fire bigger.
But let me jump in here and push back on behalf of the listener. Because when you hear phrases like drop your grievance or hatred ceases by love, it can sound suspiciously like we are being told to endure abuse passively.
Yes, that is a very common concern.
Right. Like if someone actually robs me or if a business partner defrauds me, am I supposed to just smile, send them love and light, and let them empty my bank account?
This raises an important question, and it's the critical tension in this verse. It requires us to apply wisdom with discernment. We really have to separate the enduring wisdom from a passive, doormat misinterpretation.
Okay, so what is the actual distinction?
The text is absolutely not advocating for passive victimhood. It is not saying you shouldn't seek justice or fire the fraudulent business partner or set firm boundaries against an abuser. What it is addressing is the internal state of your mind while you handle those external realities.
I see. So it's about the poison circulating in your own veins.
Precisely. If you fire the business partner, but you spend the next 10 years replaying he robbed me, he defeated me every morning in the shower, well, the business partner is still controlling your mind.
That makes total sense.
Harboring the hatred destroys you, not them. Dropping the hatred isn't a gift you give to your abuser. It is the ultimate act of self-protection, which leads directly into the text's brilliant metaphor of the ill-thatched house.
Yes. Verses 13 and 14. Let me read them. As rain breaks through an ill-thatched house, passion will break through an unreflecting mind. As rain does not break through a well-thatched house, passion will not break through a well-reflecting mind.
Think about the mechanism of a thatched roof. It isn't made of solid stone. It is made of thousands of individual pieces of straw or reed, carefully woven and layered together.
Right, it takes maintenance.
Exactly. If you don't maintain it, if you let gaps form, the rain doesn't just make the floor wet. The rain rots the remaining thatch, weakens the structural integrity of the walls, and eventually destroys the entire house.
So when you harbor grievances, when you obsessively replay how you were wronged, you are literally pulling the thatch off the roof of your own mind, handful by handful.
You're creating massive holes in your own defenses.
And when the inevitable storms of life hit, when passion, which in this context means overwhelming anger, lust, or fear, arrives, it pours right through those holes and floods your internal world.
And this ties back to Mara. Mara doesn't have to kick your door down if you've already dismantled your own roof. Mara just waits for it to rain. An unreflecting mind is a mind that pays no attention to its own structural integrity.
If we modernize this, I'd compare the ill-thatched house to a smartphone operating with zero security software.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because if you don't actively patch the operating system, which in this metaphor means doing the daily work to reflect, meditate, and build a well-reflecting mind, the malware is going to flood in. Hatred, grievance, and unbridled anger are just psychological malware.
They really are. They drain your battery.
They steal your processing power, and they eventually fry the hardware. Every single time you sit around ruminating, thinking, I can't believe Susan said that to me in the meeting, she totally defeated me, you're basically clicking on a phishing link and downloading a virus straight to your central nervous system.
That is exactly how the mechanism operates. The text is trying to save you from your own lack of mental hygiene, and it offers a powerful perspective shift in verse 6 to help patch the roof.
What does it say?
It says, the world does not know that we must all come to an end here, but those who know it, their quarrels cease at once.
That is Yama, the Lord of the Departed, entering the chat.
It is. When you deeply internalize how fragile and brief your existence is, when you remember that both you and the person you are angry with are temporary, holding on to a petty grievance suddenly seems absurdly wasteful.
It just puts everything into perspective.
Exactly. The sheer scale of mortality makes the grievance irrelevant.
Like, we are all going to die, so maybe I don't need to spend my entire Saturday furiously drafting a rebuttal email in my head.
The practical application here for you, the listener, is very direct. Sometime today or tomorrow, you are going to feel slighted.
It's guaranteed to happen.
Right. Someone will cut you off in traffic or make a passive-aggressive comment. I want you to try and catch the internal monologue the second it starts. Catch yourself when you start reciting the modern version of, he defeated me, he abused me.
And in that exact moment of awareness, consciously choose not to harbor it. Don't suppress it, don't pretend it didn't happen, but don't invite it in for a 5-course meal. Observe it and watch how the rain of that anger simply bounces off the well-thatched roof of your mind.
If you can do that, you keep the house dry. But observing this process reveals a deeply frustrating human paradox, which the text addresses at the end of chapter 1.
Which is what?
Well, if guarding the mind is so logical, if patching the roof so clearly prevents the house from rotting, why do we fail at it so consistently?
Because knowing the blueprint isn't the same as swinging the hammer.
Exactly. We constantly confuse knowing the path with actually walking the path. The text delivers a profound critique of intellectual vanity here. It brings in the striking imagery of the thoughtless person who can recite the law flawlessly, who knows all the right philosophical words, but who does not actually act on them.
And what's the imagery it uses?
Verse 19 says this person is like a cowherd counting the cows of others. They have no real share in the rewards.
The cowherd counting others' cows. I mean, that has to be one of the greatest burns from antiquity. You're just standing in the mud, tallying up wealth that belongs to someone else.
It's a hilarious and brutal metaphor.
Let's apply this to our modern information-obsessed culture. We are the ultimate cow counters today.
Oh, we have infinite access to the cows.
We do. We listen to hours of self-help deep dives. We read endless newsletters on productivity. We stockpile stoic quotes on our Pinterest boards. And we buy books on mindfulness that sit unread on our nightstands.
We get a massive dopamine hit just from acquiring the information.
Exactly. We feel productive because we learned a new mental model. We can recite the law of wellness perfectly. But if we don't actually put the phone down and sit in silence, if we don't actually forsake our hatred and forgive the person who wronged us, we own absolutely nothing. We are just a highly educated cowherd standing in a field of someone else's enlightenment.
It is a devastating critique because it exposes the ego's favorite hiding place. You know, intellectualizing virtue is a universal trap found across almost all wisdom traditions. We prefer to study the path rather than walk it because studying is safe. It feeds the ego.
We sound incredibly insightful at dinner parties when we discuss cognitive behavioral mechanisms.
Right. But true knowledge, as the text insists in verse 20, requires the actual forsaking of hatred and the possession of serenity of mind. Serenity is not achieved by having a photographic memory for ancient quotes.
It's achieved through the grueling, unglamorous, minute-by-minute work of self-restraint.
Yes. And the text also brings in a very specific historical symbol here to hammer this point home. In verses 9 and 10, it talks about wearing the yellow dress.
I was struck by this imagery. It feels like the ancient equivalent of wearing a doctor's coat when you haven't gone to medical school. How did the original audience view this?
The yellow dress refers to the saffron or yellow robes worn by the bhikshu, the monks or mendicants who had renounced worldly life. In that culture, seeing someone in the yellow dress instantly commanded deep respect. It was the ultimate, universally recognized symbol of piety, virtue, and self-control.
Okay, so it was a very big deal.
A huge deal. But the text warns that anyone who puts on the yellow dress without having actually cleansed themselves from sin, who disregards temperance and truth in their private life, is entirely unworthy of the garment.
It is the ancient blueprint for virtue signaling, like putting the right hashtag in your bio or making sure everyone sees you carrying the reusable, eco-friendly tote bag, but then treating the barista terribly because your coffee was late.
Exactly. The symbol is meaningless without the substance. And what's fascinating is how the text addresses the anxiety of the seeker who looks at the vastness of the philosophy and feels inadequate.
Because it can feel overwhelming, right?
It can. But the text explicitly praises the follower who can recite only a small portion of the law, but who actually lives it. Verse 20 says that even if a person knows very little textually, if they act purely and achieve serenity, they have a true share in the rewards.
So action fundamentally trumps erudition.
100%.
I find that incredibly comforting. You don't need a PhD in Eastern philosophy, and you don't need to memorize 100 different mental models to live a good life. I mean, is it better to know a little and do it perfectly, or know a lot and constantly struggle?
The text says take just one true thing, like don't harbor a grievance and actually build your life around it. That is the true knowledge.
But this brings us to the most difficult part of the process. How do we actually cross the bridge from just counting the cows to doing the grueling work? What is the engine that drives this behavioral change?
Well, Chapter 2 introduces this specific engine, and it is the focus of our next section. Earnestness.
Chapter 2 shifts the tone dramatically. It feels much more urgent, almost life or death.
It is framed explicitly in terms of life and death. Verse 21 declares, earnestness is the path of immortality, nirvana. Thoughtlessness, the path of death. Those who are in earnest do not die. Those who are thoughtless are as if dead already.
Wow. As if dead already.
Yeah. And we need to clarify earnestness here. The original concept doesn't just mean being sincere or well-meaning. It means diligence, acute wakefulness, continuous, mindful effort. It is the absolute polar opposite of coasting through life on autopilot.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The text says the thoughtless are as if dead already. Think about the modern phenomenon of zombie scroll.
Oh, absolutely. The perfect example.
You're on the couch, the TV is blaring in the background, your phone is in your hand, your thumb is swiping up on short-form videos, your eyes are glazed over, the algorithm is feeding the ox, and you are just dragging the cart. You are biologically alive, your heart is beating, your lungs are processing oxygen, but are you awake?
The text is arguing that living in a state of constant, unreflective reaction to stimuli, just chasing whatever shiny piece of vanity pops up next, is a form of spiritual death.
It's just sleepwalking through your own life.
Exactly. It is a state of total vulnerability to Mara. Verse 29 contrasts this beautifully. Earnest among the thoughtless, awake among the sleepers, the wise man advances like a racer, leaving behind the hack.
The hack being the slow, broken-down horse.
Right. When you wake up, when you apply earnest, continuous diligence to guarding your mind, you separate yourself from the cultural sleepwalking. You begin to move with purpose.
But there is a verse in this chapter that I think might trigger some modern alarm bells. Let's look at verse 28.
Okay, which one is that?
It says that when the learned man drives away vanity by earnestness, he climbs the terrace heights of wisdom and looks down upon the fools. Serene, he looks upon the toiling crowd, as one that stands on a mountain looks down upon them that stand upon the plain.
Yes, I can see why that would be controversial.
I can hear the pushback right now. This sounds incredibly elitist. It sounds like, I meditate for an hour a day, therefore I am fundamentally better than you peasants down there on the plain.
Yeah.
How do we navigate this imagery?
It is a vital verse to examine with wisdom and discernment, because if we misread this through a modern socioeconomic lens or a lens of class struggle, it sounds dripping with arrogance.
Right, like looking down on the working class.
But we have to look at what the fools and the toiling crowd represent in the specific psychological context of the Dhammapada. This is not about the wealthy looking down on the working class.
Then who are they?
The toiling crowd represents people who are exhausting themselves in the endless, frantic, unwinnable pursuit of material desires, vanity, and ego. They are toiling to satisfy cravings that, by their very nature, can never be satisfied.
Oh, so they are running at full speed on the hedonic treadmill. They think the next promotion, the next car, or the next viral post is finally going to bring serenity.
Precisely. And the mountain doesn't represent a throne of judgment. The mountain represents a state of serene detachment from that specific chaos. The sage isn't looking down with contempt or a superiority complex.
They are looking down with profound relief.
Yes, the relief and serenity of someone who has finally realized they can just step off the treadmill. They see the frantic rushing for what it truly is, exhausting and pointless. The elevation is a metaphor for perspective, not social superiority.
That makes total sense. It is the relief of no longer playing a rigged game. And the text makes it clear that getting off the treadmill isn't a gift, right? It's earned.
Earned through earnestness.
Yeah. Verse 30 mentions a figure named Maghavan, or Indra, saying he rose to the lordship of the gods by earnestness. Even in their mythology, supreme status wasn't like a Nepo baby situation.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't handed out by birthright. It was earned through intense, focus, relentless effort.
Earnestness is the only engine of real progress, and the text gives us a beautiful, highly practical directive in verse 25. By rousing himself, by earnestness, by restraint and control, the wise man may make for himself an island which no flood can overwhelm.
Make for yourself an island. I want you, the listener, to really hold on to that visual. We live in an era characterized by digital and emotional floods.
We're constantly drowning.
We are drowning in a flood of breaking news, a flood of urgent emails, a flood of cultural outrage, and a flood of demands on our attention. If you are just a piece of unmoored driftwood, you will inevitably be swept away by whatever the current trend or panic is.
Exactly. So the practice here is to examine your boundaries. What sandbags are you stacking today to make your mind an island?
And those sandbags are forged through the restraint and control the verse mentions.
Right. What do those look like in a modern context?
Well, maybe building your island means putting your phone in a drawer at 7 p.m. and refusing to look at it until morning. Maybe your island is a firm boundary against participating in toxic workplace gossip. Maybe your island is deleting the social media app that constantly feeds your ox with jealousy.
Those boundaries are the restraint that elevates your island above the floodwaters.
But building that island is not a peaceful process, especially at the beginning. Because the moment you try to focus, the moment you attempt to be earnest and stack those sandbags, your own mind violently rebels.
It fights back hard. Which brings us to Chapter 3, titled Thought, where we examine the mechanics of this internal rebellion. We can call this section the Fletcher and the Fish.
I love the metaphors in this chapter because they perfectly capture the sheer frustration of trying to control your own brain. Verse 34 describes a mind trying to escape the dominion of Mara, trying to escape its addiction to distraction by saying it trembles all over like a fish taken from his watery home and thrown on dry ground.
Such a visceral image.
Anyone who has ever tried to sit down and meditate for 5 minutes or even just tried to read a dense book without checking their phone knows exactly what that trembling fish feels like.
It is the visceral panic of habituation. The mind is flighty, artful, and it rushes wherever it wants, constantly seeking the next dopamine hit. When you remove that stimulation, when you pull the mind out of the waters of constant distraction and place it on the dry ground of earnest focus, it panics.
It flops around.
It begs you to check your email just one more time. The text deeply acknowledges how incredibly difficult it is to hold the mind back.
It is exactly like trying to walk a hyperactive toddler through a crowded, dangerous parking lot. You can't just let go of their hand and trust that they will make good choices.
No, they're going to bolt for the nearest moving car because it's shiny.
Exactly. You have to guard them. You have to hold them back. But how you hold them back is where we usually fail. We tend to use violence against ourselves. And that's where the Fletcher metaphor is so brilliant. Verse 3 says, "As a Fletcher makes straight his arrow, a wise man makes straight his trembling and unsteady thought."
A Fletcher is a craftsman who makes arrows. And the mechanics of fletching are vital to understand here. If you have a curved, unsteady piece of wood, you don't straighten it by putting it over your knee and snapping it.
Right, because it would just break.
Exactly. If you apply sudden, violent force, the wood shatters. You straighten an arrow by carefully, steadily applying gentle heat and consistent pressure over a long period of time.
We get this so wrong. When we realize we've been scrolling for an hour, we get furious with ourselves. We beat ourselves up. We try to snap the mind into focus through sheer willpower and self-loathing.
But the text says you have to be the Fletcher. You apply steady, warm attention. When the mind wanders, you gently, firmly bring it back. You apply the heat of earnestness over and over without snapping the arrow.
This gentle, firm guarding is absolutely vital because of the inherent vulnerability of our human condition. Verse 40 gives us another profound contrast to highlight this vulnerability.
Yes, it says, knowing that this body is fragile like a jar and making this thought firm like a fortress, one should attack Mara with the weapon of knowledge.
This verse completely inverts our modern priorities. We live in a culture that is utterly obsessed with treating the physical body like a fortress.
We really do. We track our macros, we take a dozen supplements, we plunge into freezing ice baths, we do high-intensity interval training, we try to biohack our way out of aging.
We try to make the body invincible. But the text bluntly states that the body is just a fragile jar. Eventually, as verse 41 says, it will lie on the earth, despised without understanding, like a useless log. The jar is going to break.
Yama comes for the jar no matter how many ice baths you take.
Exactly. But the mind, the modern world leaves the mind as fragile as a thin clay jar. We let a single mean comment online shatter our peace for a week. We let a rude driver ruin our entire day.
The ancient wisdom says we have our defensive perimeters entirely backward, except that the body is a fragile jar and pour your relentless effort into making your mind the fortress.
The stakes of this defensive alignment are incredibly high. The text warns us in verse 42, whatever a hater may do to a hater, or an enemy to an enemy, a wrongly directed mind will do us greater mischief.
But conversely, in verse 43, it offers the ultimate reassurance. Not a mother, not a father will do so much, nor any other relative. A well-directed mind will do us greater service.
Your mind is either your most dangerous, unpredictable enemy, or it is your most devoted ally. So the reflection for you here is stark. Are you treating your mind as an unsupervised enemy, letting it run wild, dragging heavy carts and pulling the thatch off your roof? Or are you treating it like a fortress, applying the Fletcher's steady pressure to make it an ally that serves you better than anyone else could?
If you can do the latter, if the arrow is straight, if the fortress is built, if the island is secure above the flood, then and only then are you ready to truly interact with the world. You cannot stay on the island forever.
Right. You must step out of isolation and engage with society.
Which leads us perfectly into Chapter 4, titled Flowers, which forms our final major section, the village sage.
Because we still have to go to the grocery store, we still have to navigate office politics, we have to deal with neighbors and family members. How do we move through a world that is beautiful, highly tempting, and sometimes incredibly toxic without losing the serenity we just worked so hard to build?
The text provides one of the most elegant, visually striking blueprints for moving through society in verse 49. It says, "As the bee collects nectar and departs without injuring the flower or its color or scent, so let a sage dwell in his village."
The bee and the flower. This has to be the ultimate ancient lesson in mindful consumption in non-extractive relationships.
Consider the biological mechanism of the bee. The bee must interact with the flower to survive. It takes sustenance, the nectar, from the flower, and through pollination, it actually benefits the ecosystem.
But crucially, it does not crush the petals.
It does not steal the color. It does not ruin the scent. It extracts exactly what it needs for sustenance, and it departs lightly, leaving the beauty of the flower entirely intact.
How do we actually do that today?
Yeah.
How do we move through our workplaces, our environments, and our friendships without extracting, exploiting, or injuring the flowers?
It's difficult because human beings have a terrible tendency to consume things heavily.
We do. We drain our friends with our constant drama and need for validation. We exploit our environments. We often go into a networking event or a relationship asking, what can I take from this person? How can I leverage them? Instead of buzzing in lightly, sharing a mutual exchange, and leaving the person's dignity and energy intact.
The bee is the perfect model for the bhikshu, the seeker, moving through the village of the world. You must engage to survive, but you must do it without leaving a wake of destruction, heavy footprints, or clinging attachments.
And part of not leaving a wake of destruction involves a radical restraint of judgment.
Yes. This brings us to a significant obstacle for the modern listener. Found in verse 50, it reads, "Not the perversities of others, not their sins of commission or omission, but his own misdeeds and negligences should a sage take notice of."
Oh, wow. Mind your own business, raised to the level of a spiritual absolute.
Yes, and this is deeply uncomfortably countercultural today. We are entirely conditioned by call-out culture. We are trained by social media algorithms to constantly publicly judge the failings of others. We are socially rewarded with likes and retweets for noticing, amplifying, and dissecting the perversities and sins of other people.
So what does this all mean for us? Because, again, I have to push back here. If I only look at my own misdeeds and negligences, does that mean I ignore systemic injustice?
Right, do you just let bad things happen?
Yeah. If I see someone doing something terrible in my community or a corporation polluting a river, do I just look the other way and say, well, I need to focus on my own flaws? That feels like a recipe for a completely amoral society.
It is a vital question, and again, we must apply wisdom with discernment to avoid a destructive misinterpretation. The text is not advocating for moral blindness. It's not saying you should allow evil or abuse to flourish unchecked in your community.
Okay, then what is it addressing?
It is addressing the internal locus of control and the ego's devious tendency to use the flaws of others as a distraction from its own required work.
Oh, it's the classic deflection tactic.
Exactly. It is infinitely easier to critique someone else's flooded, ill-thatched house than it is to do the grueling work of patching the roof of your own mind. When your primary spiritual or intellectual activity is pointing out the sins of others, your mind remains full of passion, anger, and judgment.
You aren't building your island. You're just treading water in the flood, yelling at other people who are also drowning, telling them their swimming technique is wrong.
That hits incredibly hard. But it's true. We use our outrage at other people's failings as a shield to avoid earnestness in ourselves. We think our anger at their sins makes us righteous, but it actually just makes us thoughtless.
Wow. You cannot achieve serenity if your gaze is permanently, obsessively fixed outward on the failings of the village. You must turn the gaze inward. You must straighten your own arrow first.
And when you do that, when your actions finally align with your internal work, you produce something the text calls the fragrance of virtue.
Let's talk about that fragrance, because verses 51 and 52 draw a sharp contrast between fine but fruitless words and fine and fruitful words.
Yes, the fruitless words are like a beautiful flower that has no scent. It looks great on Instagram. It sounds profound when you tweet it, but there is no substance behind it.
Right. But the fruitful words, the words of someone who actually acts on what they say, who doesn't just count the cows, are like a flower full of vivid color and full of rich scent.
And the text makes a beautiful observation about the physics of the scent. In verse 54, it notes that the scent of regular flowers or even rare, expensive perfumes like sandalwood or tigra cannot travel against the wind.
They are bound by the physical laws of nature. The wind dictates where their influence goes.
Exactly. But the odor of good people travels even against the wind. A good man pervades every place.
I have met people like that. You walk into a room and you can just feel their integrity. You can feel their serenity. It doesn't matter which way the cultural wind is blowing. It doesn't matter what the current outrage trend is. Their character cuts right through the noise.
That fragrance is the ultimate natural result of the earnestness, the thought-guarding, and the mindful bee-like interaction we've been discussing today. The perfume of virtue is unsurpassed because it is entirely authentic.
It isn't the yellow dress you just throw on to look the part.
Exactly. It is a natural, inevitable byproduct of a tamed mind.
So the practical practice here is a quick, brutal check-in before you speak today, before you offer those fine words, before you post that inspirational quote or give unsolicited advice to a friend. Ask yourself, does this have the scent of action behind it? Have I done the work? Or am I just a colorful but scentless flower, trying to look good without producing any real fragrance?
It is a question that requires deep earnestness to answer honestly.
This has been an incredible journey through just these first 4 chapters. We have covered so much ground today. We started with the architecture of our thoughts, realizing that the cart of our reality must follow the ox of our attention.
We looked at the ill-thatched house of grievance and how replaying our victimization rots our own roof.
We confronted the cow herd, counting other people's enlightenment, and the earnestness required to finally build our island against the digital flood.
We watched the Fletcher apply gentle heat to straighten the arrow of the mind, and finally we learned how to move like the bee, gathering nectar without crushing the village.
It is a complete, remarkably sophisticated psychological system for waking up and taking absolute responsibility for your own reality. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative image from the very end of chapter 4.
It's a powerful one.
Verses 58 and 59 say, "As on a heap of rubbish cast upon the highway, the lily will grow full of sweet perfume and delight. Thus the disciple of the truly enlightened Buddha shines forth by his knowledge among those who are like rubbish, among the people that walk in darkness." A lily growing on a heap of rubbish. That is quite the visual to end on.
It is meant to be jarring, but also profoundly hopeful. If you feel like you are currently surrounded by a world of darkness, of thoughtlessness, or cultural and workplace rubbish, if you feel like your environment is entirely toxic and against you, remember this mechanism.
A lily does not need a pristine, perfectly manicured Zen garden to grow.
No, it can grow full of sweet perfume and delight right there on the rubbish heap. Your earnestness, your effort to straighten your own mind and patch your own roof allows you to shine forth and grow beautifully right where you are, regardless of the mess that surrounds you.
You do not have to wait for the world to get its act together before you bloom. You don't need the perfect environment to start building your island. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.